Last week, we started a series. It's a mini series. We're going to be finishing it today. We started a new series called Jesus for President. And if you weren't here last week, I would encourage you to go back and to watch that. You can find it on our website, fairfaxcirclechurch.org. But if you missed it, or if you just simply need a refresher from what we talked about last week, here's what we talked about. So we talked about the term gospel. The term gospel is often translated as good news, which is a fine translation, but it doesn't really give us any context into which this word is most often used. And so if we were going to give maybe a more literal translation, a little better translation, a little more context, probably a better translation would be something like an exciting political announcement, like one that somebody would make for a political campaign. And so last week, we began retelling the story of Jesus with a modern twist and a local location to make this story more relatable to our context. And so we took some of the gospel's language of a monarchy and we changed it to the language of a democracy, like we live in. Hopefully making it a little bit easier to see the good news that Jesus is running for president of the world. And so where our Bible might refer to Jesus as the King of Kings, language of a monarchy, we might refer to Jesus as the President of Presidents, language of a democracy. Or where our Bible might refer to Jesus' good deeds as the coming of the kingdom of heaven, we might refer to Jesus' deeds as the coming of the nation of heaven. So hopefully you can see how we're giving relatable political terms to the gospel language. And so, as such, as president, Jesus wants to make the world more like heaven. Jesus wants to bring justice and peace. And so Jesus' campaign speech, it started like this. The nation of heaven is coming soon, so repent and believe the rumors about my campaign. And so from there, Jesus hit the campaign trail to further his claim that God is becoming president. Jesus healed people. He threw campaign celebrations. He offered forgiveness freely. And he made it clear that this is what it looks like when God is in charge. And God is in fact in charge, and he's had enough of all of the evil and the suffering and the pain and the chaos that's going in the world. And so he sent Jesus, and Jesus is stepping in as president. But as we learned last week, and we're going to learn even better this week, that's not just exciting news, that's also fighting news. So not everyone wants to celebrate Jesus' campaign for president. In fact, a lot of people are accusing Jesus of treason. And it didn't help the fact that we ended last week with Jesus rolling into our nation's capital, into Washington, D.C. He got to the Capitol steps, he walked up to the top, and he yet again proclaimed that God is in fact becoming president. No debates, no elections, it's just happening. And so today, as we continue our modern retelling of the gospel story, we find that more and more people are against Jesus every day, and it's reached the point that Jesus has been arrested on charges of betraying his country and attempting to overthrow the government. And so as we start today's story, as we start today's retelling of the gospel story from where we left off last week, where we find Jesus is sitting in a jail cell in Washington, D.C. And as Jesus is sitting there, there's all these angry protesters that are going around collecting signatures on a petition because they want to see Jesus brought to trial immediately. They want to see him stopped. And so as they're doing that, he's sitting in a jail cell. He's waiting for this trial to happen. But in the meanwhile, dirty cops are harassing Jesus. They're occasionally spitting on him. They're hitting him with their batons. They're saying things like, where's the Secret Service? I mean, aren't they supposed to protect the president? They're mocking him for his claim. And so this goes on for a while until finally they have, in fact, gathered enough petitions to send Jesus to an immediate trial at the Supreme Court. And so while at this hearing, Pilate, the judge, he asked Jesus a question. He says, "They say you are president. What nation are you president of?" And Jesus responds to Pilate. He says, "I am president of God's nation, the nation of heaven." And so Pilate, he proceeds to ask Jesus a couple more questions. But at this point, Jesus decides that he's going to stay silent. And so Pilate eventually becomes very frustrated with this. He also becomes quite confused because Jesus just refuses to defend himself. I mean, Jesus even refused his right to an attorney. And so Jesus has rendered himself defenseless. It's almost like this is exactly where Jesus wants to be. But nonetheless, Pilate, he took all of this in, he assessed the situation, and he decided that he saw nothing treasonous nor threatening about Jesus. I mean, sure, Jesus had made the claim that he is president, but it's not like he had forced his way into the Oval Office or attempted to assassinate the president or anything like that. In fact, Jesus had been going around healing people. Jesus wasn't hurting people. And so Pilate, he made his decision, and he decided that he would let the court know. And so he announced it, and the court erupted in disapproval. I mean, they were so upset. They were booing, and they were calling for Jesus' head. And they were just so opposed to Jesus. They were so upset about Jesus that they were just not going to give up until they had seen Jesus come to their justice. And the only reasonable justice in their minds was death. And so here's one of the craziest parts of the story. Pilate becomes so overwhelmed by all of the hate and the bloodlust for Jesus that he allows it. He changes his decision. He decides that he is going to give Jesus the death penalty for treason. And so it seems like rage and hate and sin has overtaken the Capitol because people are cheering for Jesus' execution. And at this point in the story, based on what we understand about Jesus, you're just kind of questioning, like, why? Like, Jesus, why don't you stand up for yourself? I mean, you've been healing people and forgiving people. You haven't been leading a revolt. But Jesus came to bring justice and peace. Jesus came to not to fight back. He didn't want to bring more chaos and violence because that would be the very opposite of what Jesus came to bring. Jesus didn't believe in fighting fire with fire. He believed in loving your enemies. Jesus didn't believe in taking an eye for an eye. He believed in turning the other cheek. Jesus' enemies, they wanted to kill Jesus, and he was going to let them. And I say let them because it's like Jesus could have stopped them, right? I mean, Jesus could have called an army of angels to come down and to fight them and to set him free. Jesus could have snapped his fingers like Thanos and just turned people into dust. Jesus had all these abilities. And many of Jesus' followers, they were waiting for this to happen. They were expecting Jesus to do just that. But Jesus never does. And so I would assume this is probably where some of Jesus' most enthusiastic followers started fading away. They probably thought that this was a sign that Jesus was no different than probably some of the other people who have tried and failed to overtake the government or to lead a revolt in some way. Without successfully taking rule by force, Jesus no longer seemed like the Messiah that people were expecting. Jesus no longer seemed like the prophesied president. He no longer seemed like the chosen one. He just seemed like an ordinary, defeated man. And so the mob of people, they go to prepare Jesus for his execution and his torture. But first they want to break his will before they kill him. And so they strip Jesus completely naked to humiliate him. And they take a presidential-looking tie and they put it real tight around his neck so it's choking him. And they take one of those presidential flag pins and they stick it directly into his skin. Right? They're again mocking him for claiming to be president. And so they finally are getting prepared to get him ready to be executed. And they begin assaulting him, but they do it slowly because, again, they want him to suffer. And so this goes on for a while, and it is brutal until finally they see that it's time to finally kill Jesus. And so they put him into an electric chair, the most notorious modern-day execution machine, and they finally kill Jesus, and he dies. And so Jesus is dead. Everything that people have been excited about, everything that people have been looking for, many of them feel like it's over. But for Jesus, something different was happening. For Jesus, something different was happening than a violent killing. Jesus was actually ushering in a new nation with his death. Normally, a new nation takes over by conquering another nation. But Jesus does things upside down. Jesus wasn't going to become president of the world by conquering his enemies. Jesus was going to become president of the world by an act of sacrificial love. Jesus even asked for forgiveness for the people that were executing him as he suffered. Jesus displayed true political authority by giving a presidential pardon to his executioners. He was the one that was in charge that day. He was the one that was giving his life for others. And so while to Jesus' mortified followers and his enemies, it looks as if Jesus has been defeated and killed, we have the luxury of knowing what happens next, right? Like we don't have to sit there holding our breath because we know that Jesus may be dead, but the story is not over. We know that while it looks like Jesus died because of his enemies, Jesus actually died for his enemies. Jesus is the president who defeated death not with violence, but with love. Jesus came to defeat sin's grip on the world not with fighting, but with peace. And so this is the beginning of the reign of the nation of heaven that Jesus has been foretelling about. This nation is filled with healing and forgiveness and humility and peace. The nation of heaven, it is filled with love that cannot be defeated even by death. But if we go back to our story, Jesus is still dead though. Jesus, at this point, he's been buried, and his grave, it is being guarded since it was such a controversial and chaotic death. And so Jesus, his remaining followers are left devastated. They really thought that he was going to become president and he was going to finally make the world right. And so they watched Jesus die with their own two eyes. Their hope is gone. It is over. And so a few days after Jesus has been buried, one of Jesus' closest followers, Mary, she wants to go and lay fresh flowers on Jesus' grave. And so when she gets to the cemetery, she checks in with the guards, and the guards let her through, and so she heads towards Jesus' plot. And so as she's approaching the place where they buried Jesus, she notices that there is dirt everywhere. And so as she gets closer, she sees that the place they had originally buried Jesus has been dug up, and she looks down into the hole, and there is a casket, and it is open, and there is no body inside. And so she frantically pulls out her phone, and she calls the disciples, and she's like, Jesus is not here. His body is not here. Somebody has taken it. And so the disciples, they rush over, and they quickly get to the cemetery, and they are just in disbelief and sadness. They cannot believe that somebody would take his body. I mean, they're thinking they have already killed him. Do they really need to disrespect his body too? And so the disciples, they head home to grieve and to just try to figure out what they're going to do to find Jesus' body. But Mary lets them know that she doesn't want to go yet, that she wants to sit there for a while. And so the disciples, they leave, and Mary sits down by Jesus' grave by herself, and she just cries, and she cries, and she cries, and she cries, until she doesn't have any tears left to give. Until all of a sudden, she hears a stranger say, "Why are you crying?" Mary had not heard this person walk up, but she says that they took my president's body. Someone came and stole my president's body. She doesn't realize that she's actually talking to an angel. She thinks she's talking to the cemetery's gardener. And so she says to him, she's like, "Did you see anything? Do you know where they took his body?" And she again starts to fill her eyes with tears again. But before the angel can reply to Mary, Mary hears another voice, "Mary." She knew that voice. She recognized that one. She turned around, and it was Jesus. It was him. And so she runs to him as quickly as she can, and she holds him tight, and she's like, I can't believe it's you. And we thought somebody took your body, and here you are. And so she's like, I got to call the disciples. They're never going to believe this. And so she reaches in her phone, her pocket for her phone, and she clicks to dial the disciples. She puts it up to her ear, and when she looks up, Jesus is gone. And so she's telling the disciples everything that has just happened, and she rushes off to go and meet them. And so she gives them all the details that she can possibly give, and the disciples, they're not sure what to think about this. I mean, they start arguing amongst themselves. They are in disbelief. They watched Jesus die. How could he possibly be alive? And so as they're arguing amongst themselves, all of a sudden Jesus just appears in the room. And he says, I hope you all have been all right. And the disciples, they're taken back, but they rush over to Jesus and they start hugging him and they start asking him questions. And Jesus starts showing them his wounds and saying, yeah, this it's me, and this all really did happen. And so Jesus does this for many other people as well. He starts showing himself to other people, groups of people, that he's back, he's alive. And so he does this for a while until Jesus finally decides that it is time for him to go back to heaven. But before Jesus left, Jesus charged his followers to spread the good news of his campaign, that God has become president to bring justice and peace to the world, and it all began at Jesus' death. Death is not the end of Jesus' divine presidency. It is the start of it. It is the inauguration, and his resurrection, it proved that. Jesus' presidency, it has started, but it's not fully here yet. The nation of heaven, it is growing. And so when Jesus comes back, he is going to finish making earth more like heaven, and he is going to rule as president. So this is our gospel. This is our good news. And so until Jesus comes back, he is going to continue what he did before. He's going to continue to forgive people. He's going to continue to heal people and to party. But he's not going to be doing it alone. And so this is where you come into the story. This is why we've been going through this modern retelling of the gospel story this week and last week, because you need to see yourself in this story. This story needs to be relevant to you, because Jesus charged all of his followers, including you, to continue his campaign, to continue spreading the gospel. You are meant to serve as presidential ambassadors in the world around you. You're meant to walk the earth like you represent the president, but not just any president. Jesus, president of the world. You are to spread the gospel by what you say and by what you do, like Jesus did. You are supposed to be instilling Jesus' presidential values in the world around you. You're supposed to be showing people forgiveness. You're supposed to be healing people. You're supposed to be celebrating with people. Why? Because God is president, and you are a part of his nation as a follower of Jesus. And so you are living as Jesus' presidential political team. You are living on the campaign trail. And you are left with the question of, will you spread the good news that God has become president by how you speak and by how you live? Are you going to help people come to know their president, Jesus? He is the president of all presidents. He's the best one. He died and he came back to life to bring justice and peace to the world. This is the good news. This is our gospel. But as we wrap up this series, I just want to lay all the cards on the table, okay? If we were being completely honest here, as we hear this story, it is not an easy story to believe. In fact, it sounds kind of crazy when you first hear it. And as we were going through this modern retelling, you may have felt that at many times, to think this is absolutely ridiculous. But there is something that happens. There is something that happens when people tell the story of Jesus and they start living like Jesus is truly president of the world. That's when the gospel becomes the best news that you have ever heard. Jesus' life, death, and resurrection has done so much good for the world, and Jesus wants to continue doing good through you. He wants you to live the Great Commission. He wants you to share the gospel. And in sharing the gospel is far more dependent on your hands than it is on your mouth. In fact, your hands should be way, 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 way busier sharing the gospel than your mouth should ever be. The gospel is merely a story unless you live as if it is true. How you interact with others, it either furthers the nation of heaven or it puts it in jeopardy. Because there is nothing more diswitnessing to Jesus and the nation of heaven than Christians who live with different values than Jesus. You cannot expect the world to believe in the existence and influence of God if the very people who claim that God is living inside of them belittle others, hoard their resources, and remain exclusive and closed-minded. Because isn't that people's biggest complaint about politicians? I mean, don't people complain that they feel like politicians, their words are fake and that their words are hollow? They do what they got to do to get into office, and then the moment they get there, they don't seem to live up to the things that they had been promising you all along. Please don't be a stereotype as an ambassador for Jesus. Because an ambassador represents a country. If one of our ambassadors of the United States, if they go to another country and they start causing trouble, it causes trouble for our nation, right? They have a very important and sensitive task. And so you have been made an ambassador of the nation of heaven. Your task is also important and sensitive. You represent the nation of heaven. You represent God's dwelling place. You represent Jesus. In fact, you have the Spirit of God living inside of you, and so you should live as though that is true. You should be generous. You should be inclusive. You should heal people. You should feed people. You should forgive people. You should celebrate with people. And you should leave the judging and the presidential actions up to God. You are not the president. You are the ambassador. Let me say that again. You are not the president. You are the ambassador. Be an ambassador for President Jesus because the nation of heaven is here and its continued presence, in large part, it depends on you as followers of Jesus. So as we close this series, let's get to the point. When we update the language of the gospel to our context, we see that the gospel is the news of Jesus running for president of the world. To put it even more broadly outside of our context, the good news is that God, through Jesus, is taking charge of the world. Jesus is king, Jesus is president, Jesus is emperor, Jesus is prime minister. The metaphor works all the same, and that's what we're witnessing within the gospel story. Jesus is using metaphor and context to communicate to his audience, to be able to relate to them about what they are witnessing, what is happening. And so the message that you're supposed to walk away with is that God is in charge, that God cares about everyone, and that there is nothing that you can do to make God stop caring about you. Not persecution, not torture, not even death can stop God from caring about you. Jesus wants to make the world more like heaven. Jesus wants to bring justice and peace. And he is hoping that you're going to help him do it. Let's pray together this morning. Jesus, thank you so much for your love for us, for the life that you lived. God, please help us to be great ambassadors of you. Help us to walk around this earth and represent you well. Help us to understand your campaign. Help us to understand your values. Help us to understand what it means to be a follower of Jesus and to represent God in the world around us. Help us to do that together. Help us to fulfill the very purpose that you gave to us as the church. Help us to be more and more like you every day, Jesus. God, we love you so much. We pray that you will bless us and lead us, and we pray this in your name, Jesus. Amen.